Hello and welcome to today's FP Virtual Dialogue, the future of conservation, investing in African-led solutions. We're going to explore the vital role of conservation in ensuring a sustainable future for Africa and the globe. My name is Carol Pino, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator this morning. Before we go forward, let's first look back. When the US, Europe, and much of the global north industrialized, they also destroyed much of their biodiversity. By contrast, Africa today has 30% of the world's biodiversity. But here's the problem. It also has millions living in poverty. The fastest way to pull people out of poverty and to create jobs is industrialization. But that destroys biodiversity and adds to the climate change crisis. This is not an issue just for the continent. In the center of Africa is the Congo Basin, often called the second lung of the world. It's the second largest forest on the planet, and scientists recently discovered that it sequesters more carbon than the Amazon. Wherever you are in the world, your life quite literally depends on the Congo Basin. But should the 6 nations within the Congo Basin have to stay in poverty to protect the forest, especially when other countries destroyed their forests as they developed? In today's discussion, we're going to look at different paths forward, at African solutions for conservation. And we'll also look at financing, because conservation funding has not kept pace with the challenge. Despite having 30% of the world's biodiversity and 20% of the world's landmass, Africa receives just 3% of the world's climate financing. To help us unpack these issues, we've gathered a group of leaders from major international institutions and mission-driven NGOs for an action-packed discussion on balancing conservation and industrialization. Joining us today are several people that are really amazing with innovative ideas for financing conservation. I do want to note that Haile Mariam Desalegn, former Prime Minister of Ethiopia, had to send his regrets this morning. Unfortunately, due to an unavoidable conflict, he's not able to join us. Before diving in, I'd like to extend a big thanks to the African Wildlife Foundation for helping us make this event possible. So before we get started, we want to be sure that we can hear from you, our audience. We have hundreds of people tuned in and watching our live streams on social media. We've reserved a portion of this event for questions from our global audience. So here's how to write us. If you're on Zoom, click on the Q&A button below and submit your questions. Please be sure to tell us your name, organization, and where you're writing from. If you're joining us on the phone or watching the live stream, you can email us your questions. The address is events@foreignpolicy.com. Of course, we encourage you to chime in on social media. Be sure to use the hashtag AfricaForward. All right, so let's get started. We're going to start the program with understanding what exactly is African-led conservation. Joining us is Edwin Tambura, the Director of Global Leadership at the African Wildlife Foundation. Edwin, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. So let's dive right in here. Tell us, what is African-led conservation? What makes it different? And why is it necessary to have a different model?
Thank you very much, Carol. It's a pleasure to join you this morning and talk about this important topic. Well, Carol, in Shona, we have a saying that goes, Chisichako masimba mashoma, meaning that you have very little power or control over something that is not yours. As you mentioned, Africa has so much biodiversity, and its conservation is important for us all globally. However, as long as Africans do not feel they are part of ownership of that biodiversity, do not feel that they have a stake in how we do conservation on the continent, will never be successful, and that's a given. That's why African-led conservation is important, to make sure that Africans own it and are part and parcel of how we are shaping conservation on the continent, speaking to their needs, their aspirations, and that is critical for us to be successful.
So When you look at African-led conservation, give us a definition of what it means. Is it just that Africans are in charge, or are there more differences between African and Western-led conservation?
Well, there are differences. As you know, conservation as we have come to do it, maybe in the contemporary period, is probably alien to some Africans. But conservation has always been a part of how Africans live their lives in terms of how we go about our livelihoods and everything. It's part of our cultures and traditions. And so African ownership means that we are putting all those things at the center in terms of how we do conservation. There are a lot of things that can be achieved even without financing if we are to bring back that fabric of how Africans used to do conservation, how Africans interact and identify with nature. And that's what's at the core of African-led conservation. That speaks to, what already exists in how we live our lives, what already exists within our cultures. If we lose that, then as you mentioned, as development and industrialization comes in, it's going to be a disaster in terms of our natural ecosystems.
So one of the things that I thought was really interesting in working on the podcast on African-led conservation was how much it connected the dots between, it wasn't just saving animals, but it was also about people's livelihoods, about climate change. So how does that work for African-led conservation? What are the benefits of that?
Yes, absolutely. People have to be at the center. We can no longer just look at wildlife or conserving wildlife as an end in itself. We have to realize that this wildlife has coexisted. We are talking about it today because it has coexisted with people for so many years. So as we move forward, we have to make sure that people are at the center of how we are planning and designing how we do conservation. And absolutely, their livelihoods are critical to that. Millions of Africans are dependent on ecosystems and goods that come from these natural environments, and they are tied to their livelihoods. And in fact, we would never be able to provide for those livelihoods in other ways if it wasn't for some of these natural ecosystems. So at the center, people have to be at the center, and definitely their livelihoods. And for us, we don't just look at people as beneficiaries. As I said, they have responsibility. Once there is a sense of ownership, you bring in two things. You bring in responsibility. People have responsibility over that resource, over that biodiversity. But also you bring in value. People begin to value that biodiversity in the way it supports their livelihoods, in the way it supports other economic activities that are not only good for their local level ambitions, but also for general economic growth of our nations.
One thing that oftentimes in conservation, people are talking about, how many lions there are now, how many elephants, and talking about these numbers increasing. But isn't there an issue of human-wildlife conflict?
There is. And that's the balancing act we really definitely have to bring into the equation. And that's why for us, in saying it has to be people-centered, it means that first and foremost, we are including those people who live side by side with this wildlife in decision-making, in how we are planning and shaping programs. And certainly from the Africa Protected Areas Congress, that was the resounding call that, at the center should be the local communities that are bearing the brunt of living with this wildlife. They should be at the center to help us come up with the solution that are going to work in addressing issues to do with human-wildlife conflict. And certainly the importance we place upon all the conservation issues we are facing. It's not only talking about the wildlife, but also what people are doing and are bringing to the table, but also the challenges they are facing in interfacing with that wildlife. So it's absolutely important in terms of how we bring people into the equation.
Edwin, before we let you go, Africa right now is facing serious levels of habitat degradation and loss. Give us a picture of what is ultimately at stake, not just for Africa, but for the world.
Absolutely. And I think it's a case of how best do we negotiate space for wildlife. And in many respects, wildlife is a tool to conserve those habitats, but those natural ecosystems that contain, the greater suite of biodiversity ecosystem services. Because as I mentioned, for Africa foremost, these are critically tied to people's livelihoods. These are critically tied to how we are going to adapt better to climate change, or how we are going to mitigate climate change. So Africa in itself doesn't have a choice to argue around things like biodiversity loss or climate change because of the situation we face. But also, Africa is quite a big part of the equation when we think about solving biodiversity loss. 30% of that biodiversity is in Africa. So what Africa does, the development pathway we choose, is critical to how the world is going to meet targets around biodiversity loss. Equally important for climate change. Africa is concerned about adaptation. If people are able to adapt to what is happening now, the extreme events brought about by climate change in terms of flooding, severe droughts, we have to look at how we can help communities and people to adapt to these changes. And that in itself is also going to help us make sure that we mitigate some of the impacts coming from climate change.
Edwin Tambura, thank you so much for your insights and for giving us context for the discussion today. This was great. Thank you so much. For our next conversation, I'm pleased to welcome Monica Medina, Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans, International Environmental and Scientific Affairs. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Carol. Good morning. It's great to be with you today.
Oh, thank you. Well, so I want to start with looking historically at the relationship between the U.S. and Africa. Historically, it's been more prescriptive and hierarchical, but President Biden has said that his Africa strategy is looking at increased engagement and a focus on partnerships. What is this new strategy going to mean for conservation in Africa?
What I think it means is a great deal more investment in Africa and a great deal more work in Africa. We have a new strategy towards Africa that our secretary just announced in Africa 2 months ago, and we are already increasing the work that we're doing there because it's such a pivotal part of saving our environment globally and saving economies and helping Africa to achieve its own, and African communities to achieve their own goals.
COP27 resulted in a breakthrough agreement on a fund for loss and damage for developing nations that have emitted less and are yet vulnerable to climate change. The UN Secretary General called it an important step towards justice, but the agreement didn't say who is going to pay for what. And I'm wondering, what is the U.S. going to do?
We'll be engaged in the negotiations on that fund going forward, but we think we have to act now using the funds that we have and the mechanisms that we have to help Africa deal with the climate crisis. And we know that African countries want to be part of the solution. They want to provide some of those ecosystem services that Edwin talked about, not only for themselves, but for the planet. When you think about the loss of, say, trees and forest cover in the Congo Basin, that's important for the Congo, for the people who live there, but it's also important for people throughout the African continent because that Congo Basin and that forest cover creates the impetus for rainfall. So we know that there's a direct connection between conserving the environment and working hard to conserve the planet from the ravages of climate change. We know that 30% of the solutions to climate change are based in nature. So we in the US government are leaning forward on that, nature-based solutions, and of course on adaptation.
I'd love if you could just say a few of the solutions that are in nature. I think people don't always realize how many of the solutions are based in nature.
It's a huge amount of the work that we have to do is in conserving nature. And if we do that, we get a double benefit, because not only do we conserve and store carbon in the environment where it exists, which is great, and we aren't emitting more carbon, and we're using trees and planting more trees and restoring places will actually add to carbon capture capacity of nature. So things like grasslands and forests and wetlands, ice, and all kinds of areas store carbon. Even animals in the environment are like whales have been found to store carbon. I know that sounds crazy, but that's what the science tells us. So we know that provides a tremendous benefit for us for climate, but it also provides a tremendous benefit for us for biodiversity and nature. And as Edwin said so well, we need those ecosystem services. We need that rainfall that's created by the fact that we have tree cover. We need clean rivers that provide safe drinking water for people all over the world. And people don't realize it, but here, even in the US, things like ecosystem protection actually provides us tremendous amounts of services. So the drinking water in New York State is largely protected by a series of conservation areas all up and down the Hudson Valley watershed that gives New York City one of the cleanest, freshest, best sources of water in the world without nearly as much water treatment as many other cities have to use. So when we conserve nature, we actually help ourselves, and we help save the planet from the climate crisis.
That is a great description of what nature brings to it. The Biden administration recently signed on to the 30 by 30 initiative, pledging 30% of protected lands by 2030. The movement is really gaining traction, but critics say in Africa, it could result in massive human rights abuses with millions forced off their land. Now, I do want to note that President Biden signing on is only pledging the U.S. adhering to 30 by 30, and the U.S. has been very concerned with human rights abuses in conservation. But I think this really gets to some of the central issues of Western versus African conservation models. How should land be protected? Is it preserving nature away from people, or is it people at the center of nature?
It's absolutely people at the center of nature. And let me just say that the U.S. has signed on to the 30 by 30 pledge, and we will work very hard in the Biden administration to continue to get towards that 30% domestically. But we also pledge to help other countries reach that 30% as well. And right now, as we speak, there is an important conference of the parties. Just like the climate COP, there's a biodiversity COP going on right now in Canada, where the countries of the world are coming together to set that 30 by 30 framework. And although the US isn't a member of that treaty, we are actively engaged there, helping to solve the issues that are remaining to be resolved in reaching that agreement. And as for Africa, I think we don't ever see these things as in conflict with one another. We want to see nature centered on people and communities. And we think that provides them a source of governance. What most people in America don't understand is that parks here are significantly different than parks, say, in Africa, where there is a lack of governance. And when you bring in conservation, actually what that does is provide that sense of ownership that Edwin referred to, that ability to actually have control over what happens on the land. And that provides all kinds of opportunities to both be conserving and also taking some of the benefits from nature in a sustainable way. So it's not one or the other. I believe strongly that we can do both.
That's fantastic. So at I actually last saw you by video at the recent African Protected Areas Congress in Kigali. We had a video message from you that was fantastic. The conference closed with the Kigali call to action for people in nature. I'm wondering what you think of this call to action and what the U.S. is doing or planning to do to respond to it.
I think it's a wonderful thing, and we are very much engaged in trying to protect nature all over the planet, whether it's in the Amazon basin or the Congo basin, in Indonesia, at the poles. I just came back from a meeting in Tasmania where we were talking about conserving the Antarctic, where we're trying to get the countries of the world that control the Antarctic and govern it to agree to large-scale marine protection there, which would be fantastic, would be a gift to the planet. We are working hard wherever we can to help countries come up with ways to conserve and still be able to help communities be sustainable and have economies that are sustainable, that really benefit communities. So we are engaged from the top of the planet to the deepest part of the ocean, and even in space, trying to make sure that what we are doing sets up sustainable rules that allow for development, but only in the ways that are sustainable. And I'll refer to another African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, which means if you want to use the planet's resources well for everyone, go together. And that's why I think that Kigali call to action was so important. Oops, sorry, my lights. You can see we conserve energy here at the State Department.
Well, that's great. You're walking the walk.
Walking the walk.
So, were there any things in particular with the Kigali call to action that you thought were particularly important or that would be difficult to implement? Were there any things in particular that stood out for you?
I think it's always challenging to implement these very ambitious targets, like 30 by 30. We have to marry ambition with action, and that's what we're trying to do in the U.S., whether it's working with the Democratic Republic of Congo to help them understand how to best conserve important national parks, or whether it's thinking about natural resources in terms of the security implications of them. For example, water and water security. We're trying hard to achieve as much conservation as we can, as quickly as we can, and to set the right conditions so that people can benefit from the conservation of nature, and particularly in a place like Africa, where we know it's so important to conserve those last wild places on the planet. And we believe that there's not a conflict between that conservation and their own sustainable and beneficial economies. And in fact, if we don't conserve it, not only will we lose, but they will lose as well.
Definitely. Well, just one last question before we get to audience questions, and please do send your questions in. We're about 1 week away from the major U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit where you've invited 49 heads of state from Africa. One of the 3 days of the summit is entirely devoted to business and partnerships. What will you be doing? You personally, I'm interested in what will you be doing to encourage the private sector to engage in conservation in Africa? What's your schedule like on that day?
Well, I'll be busy that day trying to meet as many people as I can and to talk to as many leaders as I can, because these meetings are a fantastic opportunity for us to have both bilateral and sometimes group conversations where we think we can add value. I will point to the country of Gabon, which is doing a wonderful job of attracting outside investment in nature. We want to see that model replicated across the African continent. So I'm hopeful that we can help African leaders help other African leaders to find solutions based in nature. And I believe that we are at the cusp of having the ability to actually garner that kind of investment, because we're trying very hard now to put a value on nature. We know it has value. We just haven't always accounted for it. And we in the US government are working very hard on that. So we're hoping to spread some of that knowledge as well. And I'm so grateful to you that you mentioned the Leaders Summit, because it's something that we've been looking forward to for months now. It's a way that President Biden has used in the past, say with the Pacific Island leaders that he invited to Washington in the summer, and other leadership groups, where he brings them together, and then it allows all of us to find opportunities to have conversations that are hard to have when we're all back in our capitals.
Well, I will be excited to hear afterwards what things you moved on.
I'm looking forward to it.
So we have a question from Peter Petit at Boston Trinity Academy. How does transport infrastructure fit into African conservation? I've heard that one infrastructure piece that needs to be improved is access to markets, meaning roads. This would, I believe, benefit agricultural communities while also providing incremental improvements in those communities, possibly with a relatively small footprint if done well and in a controlled manner. How does infrastructure fit into the strategy?
I think transportation is one area that's critical, and so is energy. We know that Africa has a real need for both of these things. And if we could provide energy and internet capabilities throughout Africa, connectivity, we know that there are all kinds of businesses that could be started there that wouldn't be solely extractive in nature. And with proper roads, we know that we'll need to also provide them the ability to electrify so that we aren't creating more pollution in Africa than than they have now. So we want to find ways to be sustainable in helping them to develop. And I think in particular, energy is one of the really critical areas. Right now, Africans often burn trees to create charcoal to cook in their homes. It's bad for their health. It's bad for the environment. And if we could provide them affordable and clean energy solutions, we could transform so much of Africa that really needs that help right now and turn them into an internet engine, if you will.
That's fantastic. You know, it is so unfortunate we're out of time. So many more questions, so many more things we'd like to hear, but I do hope after the Leaders Summit that we'll hear from you again and
Happy to come back, tell you all about it. We're very excited, and I know that President Biden is really looking forward to this moment with these leaders.
Well, thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Medina, for those insights and inspiring words.
Thank you for having me this morning.
Our next conversation continues to take a closer look at funding and conservation efforts. I'm pleased to welcome our panelists, Paulo Gomes, founder, Arango Investment Corporation, and former executive director at the World Bank, and Andrew Steer, President and CEO of the Bezos Earth Fund. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. So, Andrew, maybe we can start with you. And I'd love to get an understanding of the landscape for funding. Who is funding conservation now, and what's worked and what hasn't worked?
Well, the most important people funding are those on the ground, the citizens of the countries. They are by far the most important, and the governments in those countries are in some cases doing a good job, in some cases not doing a good job. In addition to that, there is a growing availability of funding from the philanthropic sector. We were pleased last year to be able to announce $1 billion from the fund that I have the privilege of overseeing, the Bezos Earth Fund, but an additional $4 billion from another 10 foundations to support this 30 by 30 idea. And Africa has to be the starting point for all the reasons that have already been said today. Then, of course, there is the if you like, the international financial architecture that can be bilateral money from countries in the rich north, if you like, or it can be multilateral from the African Development Bank or the World Bank. And then finally, of course, the private sector has a growing role, both because actually done right, and it does have to be done right, there are very good opportunities to conserve and protect and restore land in Africa. And then finally, of course, carbon markets. Again, lots of dangers associated with carbon markets, but also potentially some very good things. So what we have to do is really think through this whole sort of jigsaw puzzle of potential funders, and none of them on their own can solve the problem. Each of them needs to stand up and be counted and actually go out of their comfort zone to go the extra mile. And so far, that's not happening. And of course, starting yesterday, COP15, the Biodiversity Convention, many of us will be up there all next week, really struggling with these issues. We need to hold each other accountable.
Wow, I have a ton of follow-up questions from that. We will get to those. I'm so glad we'll have time for this discussion. Paolo, I want to go to you and come to this loss and damage fund that was agreed to at COP27. Everyone is saying this is a fantastic, historic agreement. What are your thoughts about it?
Well, I think it was a good sign for at the end of the discussion, and it was a request by many developing countries and essentially African countries. The issue now is, what have we learned from the Green Climate Fund? It came after the commitments that was made by developed countries in Copenhagen and also after Paris COP. So it has been announced. I don't want to be skeptical about it. I think we need to see the contour of the idea, but it was a good move in terms of showing some sense of urgency with the issue of financing climate change for countries that have not played any role in terms of pollution and destroying the climate, and that now are suffering from the consequences of it, from Pakistan to Indonesia to African countries. But I think we have, if we decide to be serious about it, to really take the international architecture of the financial sector and see how to adapt it to the condition of the urgency we have now. If you look at the financial architecture that was created after the Second World War, and lead to the creation of the IMF and the World Bank, I think that financial system that has been designed, architecture at that time, need now to plug into it the real urgency of the climate change. And we don't have it. So unless we go back and we reset that financial architecture of the post-Second World War and then plug the climate change urgency, I don't think that would solve the issue of financing. Andrew, I think, has mapped out very well the effort that has been made by the private sector. But I strongly believe that the public sector, government has to step up because of the size and the magnitude of the crisis and the urgency we need to incorporate into it.
That is great. Thank you. I do want to go into the private sector. And, Andrew, I thought it was very interesting reading about the Bezos Earth Fund. There's been the hope that billions in public funds could mobilize trillions in private funds, but that hasn't necessarily happened. What is the role of the private sector? What can the private sector do? And what should they do? And how do you actually get them in the room? Because a lot of times when it's conservation, they're just not in the room.
Well, increasingly, the door is opening and the private sector, one by one, are coming into the room. Actually, and Paolo is a very good example of that, actually. I mean, some incredibly exciting African-led funds are now being established. One of the things that we did at Sharm el-Sheikh with COP27 of climate was talk about African restoration, and where conservation ends and restoration begins, there's a big overlap there. In fact, we need restoration in order to do conservation. You can't conserve all the animals and the biodiversity unless there are corridors between, pristine forests, so to speak. Well, one of the things we did at Sharm el-Sheikh was to work together to create a new private fund that actually Southbridge Capital in Rwanda is going to lead. The issue is the private sector sometimes is unable or unwilling to take the risks that are required. And that means that others have to help them. Notably, the governments of the countries themselves. These need to have policies that make it attractive for the private sector to come in. Then you need actually some serious standard setting where the NGOs and scientists need to play a role, because it's easy to do big mistakes in this field. So you need the kind of leading environmental NGOs and scientists to set standards. Then you need those who have grant money, like ourselves, like the philanthropists, but they're also like bilateral donors or the multilateral banks. They need to think much more about leverage. Most multilateral banks, and I really agree with what Paolo just said just now, most multilateral development banks do a good job, dollar in, dollar of good output out. The problem is that's not enough. Things are too urgent. Every dollar that goes in, you've got to ask the question, how is this going to leverage real change? How's it going to leverage system change? And one of the ways you can leverage it is through de-risking private investment. Another is working with governments to improve their policies. That will have a multiplier effect. Another is to engage much more thoughtfully with indigenous people and local communities, because, you know, as you were saying earlier, Carol, I mean, we've learned a lot of lessons from failure, probably more from failure than we have of success. And we need to learn those. And if you like, the number one failure we've made is sort of seeing this through the lens of a tree or a plant. We ought to see it through the lens of local people, because if we don't have that lens, it's going to be extremely difficult. And many of us, quite frankly, I mean, in earlier decades, very well intentioned, you know, we're doing great things, we're trying to do great things, but essentially we did all this sort of expert design. And then towards the end, we said, oh, by the way, we need to consult. Well, that's absolutely the wrong way around. We've got to start with, if you like, people. So a lot to learn.
You know, just in reading about the Bezos Earth Fund, I thought it was interesting. We're always hearing about public funds can leverage private funds. And yet on what I read, you were looking at it as your organization can leverage the public funds going the other way. And I thought that was very interesting.
That's actually been a very interesting thought for me as well. Is that actually, and I used to be a senior official in DFID, in the British Aid Organization, and I know the processes of thought. And I used to also be a senior official in the World Bank. It's actually very attractive for these institutions. If, let's say, 10 major philanthropists come together with a $5 billion willingness to invest, together with the governments of DRC and Republic of Congo and Cameroon and Gabon and so on, and my goodness me, wow, that makes it a little more attractive for us as a bilateral donor to come in and be part of something that actually could really shift the system and make real change sort of irresistible and unstoppable.
That's really interesting. So, Paolo, I'm going to put you on the spot because Andrew mentioned that you are doing investments. So what are you investing in these days? What should people be looking for?
Well, I think I would like to add on what Andrew was saying is the philanthropy and individuals such as Steve Bezos and the effort with Andrew in putting this fund together. And they are working actually with one of our partners, with Southbridge, is that I believe in terms of action, we need to add now to find a way for the multilateral to match the effort from the private sector. And in terms of concrete proposal, before I go into the investment, is to find a way to mobilize a set of constituency, and this will include people in the parliament of several countries, including Africa and Europe, and have a serious discussion about resetting the international architecture. But I would recommend for an institution such as the IMF, why not think about an allocation of SDR that would be dedicated to financing climate change?
I have to have you say, what is SDR?
So the SDR is, you know, to make things simple, it's like the currency of the IMF. This was a basket of money, of currency that has been created with when the IMF was created to represent the amount of funding from the country members that countries can have access to when in case of crisis. And this is more crisis related to macroeconomic situation. If we have, for example, a country like Ghana now will be going to a program with IMF, and then they will receive some resources from the IMF in order to carry on with reform. I would suggest that an allocation of that nature can be also designed to deal with financing climate change. There's nothing scandalous to think about it. I think it will be something out of the box. To go back to your question in terms of investment, we're doing a lot in terms of restoration, as Andrew mentioned. We are investing with communities in restoration of mangrove. Actually, even a small country like Guinea-Bissau, my country, we have managed in the last 3 to 4 years to sell carbon credit using carbon credit coming from mangrove. But obviously, you need to invest. That investment for square meter can cost money before you get the credits. So we have focused our energy in terms of mangrove, because we believe that the mangrove has also enormous impact in protecting the coastal area, and it's becoming also almost a national security for many countries. If we destroy the capital we have in the mangroves in West Africa, it will impact on the rice production. And if it impacts in the rice production, then you are in serious trouble, because all our urban area eats rice in many of our countries and other crops. So I think the way to make sure that people understand the links of climate change is that issues like restoration of mangrove become basically a national security aspect. And this is how we have to frame it. I'm very happy that you managed to bring in this conversation the State Department with the Secretary from Ocean and Environment, because I believe that in the ecosystem of the US administration, it's important to have such a constituency, because the message also can go up to other people in the Treasury, other people in the Congress, and this is how you mobilize that, I think, coalition for really facing the real need for financing. But it has to go beyond the private sector. What's happening with philanthropy is very good. I think even African philanthropy is getting into it. This is a good sign, but I think the public sector needs to really step in very seriously. And the first set of funders into a loss of damage and damage fund will have to come from the public sector.
Definitely. You know, one thing that's really interesting is the issue of carbon credits. Andrew, you mentioned those. Gabon may be on the verge of the largest carbon credit sale ever, and several countries are looking at following their lead. How much do you think carbon credits could solve the financing gap?
Well, the carbon credit shouldn't be a substitute, as Paolo was saying, for public money. Governments have an obligation, rich countries have an obligation, and it's terrific to listen to Monica and what the US government is now sort of engaged in doing, and so too European and other countries need to play a role. Having said that, the financial needs are so great that that carbon credits can play an important role, but there are ditches on both sides of the street. On what's called the demand side, so if I am a private company and I want to buy voluntary carbon credits, I should not be allowed to buy them unless I am already in a science-based target with regard to my own emissions on scope 1, 2, and 3. And in a way, so that's you know, there has to be a price for entry. And what one must not do is have companies who regard it easier to decarbonize in Gabon than to decarbonize in their own factories or through their own scope 1, 2, and 3. And then the second ditch is on what we call the supply side. Many, if not most, of the deals that have been done over the last 15 years have been pretty loose. Loose in several senses. Loose in the sense that the projects that were being financed had a lot of leakage. They weren't monitored very well. And they had diversion. So, I will protect this bit of forest, so you won't cut this down, but you'll go along the, a couple of miles down and deforest that. That doesn't help at all if the deforestation. So we now move to what we call a jurisdictional approach. These are extremely important safeguards on both sides. We're heavily involved in financing the, if you like, the standard setting, something called the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative and the Integrity Council for voluntary carbon markets, one on the supply side, one on the demand side. Having said that, we do believe that every company and every household should not only be decarbonizing, but should actually also be paying for the existing carbon. So I, in my household, hopefully, are decarbonizing, but I'm actually paying for the carbon I am emitting through voluntary carbon markets. Do you know what I mean? So it's a very big difference. So we're quite encouraged. I'll make one more point about Gabon, by the way, because you raised the point, Carol, about how do you make the economics work here? And I said you need governments involved. Gabon is a wonderful example whereby 10 years ago, Gabon cut a lot of trees down and exported the logs, mainly to France, but to other countries as well. They got about 5% of the value of that log when it was sold in a showroom in Paris or Beijing or wherever. 5%. They said, this is ridiculous. We're going to create a ban on raw log exports. And do you know what happened? All hell broke loose. The Europeans, especially France, which, by the way, France is now a major leader on biodiversity. So I'm not saying a word about negative about France, but back then, they put such pressure on Gabon, say, this is ridiculous. This is breaking down the international free market trading system. And they were profoundly wrong. And Gabon was profoundly right. Today, and we visited this just 3 months ago, today, Gabon processes its own logs. It now has a burgeoning furniture industry. And instead of the 4 to 6% it gets between 20 and 50%, according to how much. As a result, they can reduce the number of logs they're cutting substantially, and they make a whole lot more money. They create a whole lot of jobs. And by the way, because they're able to make that money, they are now able to monitor every single log, which is difficult. It's not a perfect system. There's some leakage. And thanks to satellite and drone monitoring, we can now monitor exactly what's going on. So that's an example of how you need the different players. You need the importing countries to say, actually, let's give these guys a break. Let's not put pressure on them not to do that. So that's an example of how different players need to play a positive role.
That is just an absolutely fantastic description of what is happening in Gabon. I was just there recently and was very tempted to buy a big dining room table from the furniture showroom. They were absolutely gorgeous. Just to finish the loop on this, we're looking at things like leapfrogging for energy for Africa, looking at solar, things like that. What do you think about the push now to make solar batteries or solar panels in Africa?
Me?
Yes, please. Sorry.
Look, African developers of renewable energy pay 25% more than any other continent for imported solar panels. By the way, they pay 200% more for imported battery storage. It's absolutely unnecessary. The reason is lots of very small investors, they have to do the importation themselves. There are no standards. They buy this stuff from China. Some of it's good quality, some of it's not. What do you do when the box arrives and it's broken? It's a nightmare. One of the things we're financing through the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet is to say, why don't we have a major thrust to eliminate that difference so that Africa doesn't pay anymore? And one of the elements, so you do pool procurement, you do standard setting, you do ports adjustment, and you start thinking about domestic, not only assembly, but increasingly the actual production. And, and it's exciting in other areas, obviously, that Africa is going to become a leader in the hydrogen economy. Namibia, for example, very exciting.
Very much
yes.
So.
What we have to be careful, though, is not to give glib advice. I sometimes see well-meaning environmentalists and even northern governments saying, look, the economics is fantastic, protect your area, it's going to make you richer, you're going to have more jobs. And then the government or whoever's the planning, so how will it work? Well, you can have tourism, you can have this and that. Yeah, but on a Monday morning, how do we actually do it? How do we actually, incentivize, the renewable energy system without distorting things so much that we're paying actually a lot more because, do you know what I mean? So there needs to be a lot more sharp pencils in this analysis.
That is really great. Thank you. Paulo, I want to come to you about trusts, conservation trusts. Several of countries have set up conservation trusts using the natural resources that they have, using the funds from that. And now you are actually looking at a continent-wide trust. So tell us about that. How are you actually going to get that funded, and how optimistic are you, and what will it do?
Well, I think the good news is that in this panel, we have a couple of people that I think we need to engage with. Look, the whole conservation, the whole protected area capital size we have in Africa is the equivalent of Australia and much more. This is what we are protecting. And I think in the early panel, there's all the discussion about the effort that Africa is doing to conserve. But we shouldn't take it for granted. This has been eroded. Those parks now, many are disappearing because it costs also money to protect those areas. And Africa has been fighting alone to do it. There's been some support, no doubt, but not enough to be able to cover the landmass. I think we mentioned earlier that if we start destroying those parks in Central Africa, the impact is going to have in terms of the Nile, because who pumps water into the Nile are basically the Congo Basin. So this continental trust has been set up, launched during the Kigali Congress, is now in this process. We have started to consult with the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister Ale Mariam, and Africa Wild Foundation, consult the African Park Director, who have been, in fact, leading this idea. And the idea now is to raise money to enable those funds that already exist to provide some resources to those funds. Here, the issue is not to replace those trusts that has been created. I give you the example, the one we have in my own country in Guinea-Bissau. With all the challenge of the country, we have managed to create the trust. It's registered in Africa and in Britain, and we have raised close to $10 million. And this money goes, it's managed by an asset management in the private sector in all transparency. And we use the revenues from the trust to fund NGOs and organizations and park directors in order to maintain them. So this continental and Pan-African trust, where you have African leading and also the leadership of Africa is fully behind it. It's certainly a way for Africa to commit itself further, but we cannot do it alone. And that's why the process of fundraising will require to have individuals such as Andrew and others for us to sit together and see how to mobilize the private sector and the philanthropy in many African countries and beyond Africa to raise money for this Pan-African Conservation Trust. But again, the ownership of Africa in this initiative is so, I was very impressed. I was brought to help work in this process, but I was very impressed by the ownership that we found through the African leadership in terms of having this Pan-African Trust. But because of the sense of urgency, we have to go fast. We shouldn't rely only on carbon credit, because the trust also can receive resources coming from the carbon credit. But again, I will emphasize, I think Andrew has mentioned it, the public sector has to step in. We need to create new financial instruments, and institutions such as IMF and the World Bank can play a role because we have a sense of urgency. This 30 by 30 is a good objective, but you have to fund it. Even the existing size of the conservation of the protected area, which is huge for the Africa size, is there. But we don't have enough resources in order to finance the guards, to finance the communities in these parks and the NGOs, African NGOs, because this expertise on conservation is now growing in Africa, and they can, in many of the countries, play the role that many international NGOs have played in the past. But the issue of the gap of financing is really on the table, and it has to be addressed in an holistic manner.
Oh, thank you so much. Paulo Gomes, Andrew Steer, thank you so much for being with us. You really laid out what the landscape is, and also some exciting opportunities and the things that are coming up that are in the future. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Carol.
For our next conversation, To provide some reflections on the discussions we've had today, I'm delighted to introduce Kadu Sabunya, CEO of AWF, our sponsoring partner for this virtual dialogue. Welcome, Kadu. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Carol.
So, as the head of AWF, what should we remember when discussing these complex issues related to conservation?
I think one thing is that there are a couple of things we need to really pay attention to. One is that the aspirations of the people of Africa, especially the economic aspirations, are non-negotiable in this conversation. That Africa needs to achieve its ambitions for development. But how that happens, where it happens, is really where the conversation is to happen. Because we can't see Africa chasing the Western world model of development. We know what happens when you do that. The second thing is really what we see that has been mentioned by all the previous speakers, that this is a global challenge. Like you said, Africa may have 30% of the global biodiversity. That is an eighth of the conservation hotspots are found in this continent. That is not by accident. It's by the sum of the actions and activities and investments Africans have been able to do. But at a minimum, we know that to be able to hold this biodiversity in place, Africans are custodians of these global assets. So the relationship between Africa and the rest of the world needs to be strengthened to ensure that the last rare species, the last wildlife places, the last large mammals on the planet can still survive and offer us the ecosystem services for the human species to survive. More than a third of fresh water of this planet is found in Africa. So it's that symbiotic relationship that we need really to emphasize. And then the third thing is the opportunities within all this conversation are critical. You find a continent of Africa that it has 70% of its population are young, but also they are the most educated Africans that have ever walked this planet. So they are more engaged in the global aspects. They are more aligned and in what the issues are, and this is their future. So we need to start that conversation, and that's a huge opportunity for the rest of the world. The other opportunity is related to the African needs for economic development. We know that technology Africa needs to develop is not on the continent, it's foreign-based. And so, therefore, that relationship that needs to be created, those negotiations, the world needs to have in Africa. So for that, Africa can leapfrog into a society that we all need to sustain that and address the challenges we have is critical. But so is financing. A lot of the financial needs for Africa's development are still based in foreign financial institutions. So the opportunity for us to negotiate a new deal, when you talk about the global community and Africa, is we need each other. So that is a huge opportunity as well. And obviously, the things that tie us together, you talked about the Congo Basin. We know that what happened is the Congo Basin doesn't stay in the Congo Basin. It shows up in Europe and in the shores of the Atlantic. So that global symbiotic relationship is critical in this conversation. I will end, though, to your question by saying that the solutions to these conservation discussions, the solution for us to sustain the biodiversity we have, especially on the African continent, are no longer based in science of conservation. They are no longer based in the tools we've used to conserve and sustain the 30% of the global biodiversity. They are now increasingly economic discussions. They are now increasingly political discussions. They are now increasingly social discussions. And that's what means is that they have to be African-led. You cannot continue having non-African led conversations around conservation to solve a political negotiation or economic negotiations. That is not going to happen anywhere in the world. Europeans are not in North America negotiating how North America needs to conserve, and neither are North Americans in Europe trying to do this because we are so successful as a community, because the conversation then were based on designs of conservation strategies. We are based on understanding the science of conservation. We are based on understanding the relationship between species. Now, you're going to take that conversation in parliaments, head of states, in the policy discussions, and it must be African-led in Africa.
Now, I just want to point out, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but you are the only African CEO of an international conservation institution. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I don't take that for granted. Neither do I take as a point of proudness. We are where we are. We are the oldest, largest Pan-African international conservation. Obviously, there are so many conservation NGOs on the continent that are national in all aspects, that are led by Africans. But at this stage, I find myself alone in this sphere. And we all know how unsustainable that is. We all know the importance of this negotiation. Andrew pointed that out when he was discussing, but he talked a lot in terms of institutions, that, the partnership between private sector, public funding, and individual philanthropy. But also in there is the African voice, if we are to solve African problems. So we need to have more players where we can bring out the African perspectives, the history, and the relationships, and how Africa sees these solutions and challenges and problems. They don't have to be the right way, but Africa's opinion matter in order to find a solution. And how Africa defines that is critical in order for the world to know how it responds. That's why it's so important when we are discussing the Kigali Call for Action. This is the first time we were one of the conveners together with IUCN and the government of Rwanda, where we had 3,000 people on the ground. And for the first time, Africa deciding why this is important, why conservation is important to Africans, why biodiversity, what needs to happen, what commitments Africa needed to make. And we did. And I think the opportunities that this offers to all global communities, and the Secretary Madila is right, is that this is a huge opportunity for example, US government for the first time to buy into an African strategy and support and create that relationship to ensure that Africa implements its programs, but also is held responsible and accountable to these commitments, because they align with all these international conventions, and they're not far off to what US government has today as its policy for Africa. So the African voices and perspective is critical, and that's where I found myself. And so far, I'm holding that font.
Well, I will say at the APAC Congress, it was amazing, the energy in the room and how much excitement the Africans brought to the issue. So it's really just a wonderful thing to see. And we look forward to hearing more updates in the future. Karu Sibunya, thank you so much for being with us, for sharing your insights and your views on the future. It's a topic that often has people feel like it's depressing, and yet you bring such optimism to it. So we appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Today's conversation has been enlightening and rich with examples of how governments, organizations, and others can more effectively support conservation efforts in Africa. If you've enjoyed the discussion today, Well, we have a lot more for you. Be sure to check out the FP Analytics Synthesis Report that has key takeaways from the 2022 Africa Protected Areas Congress, APAC. And be sure to listen to our 4-part podcast, Season 2 of Africa Forward, which offers interviews with experts and stories throughout the continent of African-led conservation. Links to both are available on FP's event page. And a big thanks again to AWF for supporting this project. Join us for our upcoming events, including FP's Virtual Dialogue, A New Cold War, The Rise of Authoritarianism, and the Future of Democracy, which will be held this Monday, December 12th at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Following that, we'll host Food Plus, an FP Summit, a week from today on Wednesday, December 14th. This event, which brings together global leaders across the continent, from industry, across government, industry, finance, and civil society, will be in person in Washington, D.C. and live streamed on foreignpolicy.com/events. Stay tuned for updates and find out more at foreignpolicy.com. Take care, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.